preface this with saying that neither of us here tonight we are not scholars, nor are we experts in every aspect of history. We are both longtime living history. We've come to Logan Station since year one. We've came here, set up. We've exhibited this. We like to research it, and we find ourselves lost in conversations about the happenings and going-ons and events and people that have been dead for 300 years. So by all means, if you do know more than we know about a subject, feel free to come up and talk to us or talk with us about it. If there's anything about this tonight that you just outright disagree with, I do have some reading materials up here and some references. I'll be glad to share them with you. But like I said, we find ourselves talking about these people and these happenings and these going-ons that were 300 years ago. And we don't know every detail. We may never know every detail. But what's happened is, while we were talking about this, we always hit the highlights. We always have Daniel Boone, we have James Herod, we have Benjamin Logan, and we all know those people, right? We can all agree that those are well-known people. What we found as we were lost in these conversations, we were doing this research, is not only do we have those people, but we have people that were adjacent to history. People that did things that shaped the entire state, the entire country, or the movements of those very famous people, but they're just not covered as well. They're not discussed as well. So what started out as we were going to talk about market hunters and the struggles that they went in, and I had my pack all together, and I was going to show you guys my blanket roll, and all of these things, has become a discussion of these people that are adjacent to all those great things that were happening. They were definitely here, and they were definitely doing things, but they were not Daniel Boone. Did Daniel Boone know them? Absolutely. Did Daniel Boone look up to them? That may be some matter of debate. But they were not those three big names that everyone knows. And first, what we wanted to do was backtrack and kind of set the stage for what was happening from here all the way down to an area in Virginia, the corner of Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and what is now Kentucky, in a place called the Holston River Valley, which was a unique location in the world in that it held the last mystery as white people moved west from the east. So that's where we're going to get from there. Ike's going to lay out a little bit of a background and get us started, and then we'll start talking about some of these interesting folks that were adjacent to history.
Hope y'all don't mind. I have to use notes. In my infirm age, the memory just isn't there anymore. But at the end of the King George's War in 1748, this area was in contention. The French wanted it to connect, Canada down into Louisiana and the Gulf area. The British wanted it to push farther west. So, and then you had the natives here, naturally, they were all doing their thing, using it for hunting, and they used it kind of like a store ground. They didn't particularly live here, as their residence was more like in Chillicothe, across the Ohio. So we had all these people jockeying for position here. In 1750 or so, a fellow by the name of Dr. Thomas Walker was, I don't want to say hired by the Loyal Land Company because he was part owner in it, but he had such a stake within the Loyal Land Company that they said, here, you get to go do this. So they gave him a land grant. The British gave Loyal Land Company a land grant of 800,000 acres.
727,000. Some records show 870,000.
So, 800,000, close to 1 million acres, which was primarily that Holston River area. So he comes in during that time, and And, you know, Dr. Thomas Walker's the man that named the Cumberland River. He named Cumberland Falls. He ultimately named the Cumberland Gap inadvertently. You know, they were saying it's the Gap. It was originally Cave Gap. And, you know, everybody just started calling it the Gap to the Cumberland River. So it just got shortened down to Cumberland Gap. But right, he came in 1750 with his crew. He had Ambrose Powell, William Tomlinson, Colby Chew, Henry Lawless, and John Hughes. And the stories that he packed back into the settlements of just the abundance of wildlife here. In his journals, he says, "We killed in the journey 13 buffaloes, 8 elk, 53 bears, 20 deer, 4 wild geese, about 150 wild turkeys, besides the small game, and we might have killed 3 times as much if we'd wanted it." So there was wildlife just laying on top of each other in this country. And word of that got back to the folks, you know, in North Carolina, Virginia, and that kind of put the spark in a lot of people. Now, at the same time that Dr. Walker was in the area, there's a fellow by the name of Christopher Gist. Gist was hired by the Ohio Company to do pretty much the same thing. They paid him 150 pounds to explore the country of the Ohio River as far as the falls of the Ohio. So basically where Louisville is now. And he also was tasked to endear the natives to the British plight. So he's going along, he's exploring, making deals with natives. And they say that Christopher Gist is the first man to have a Protestant church service in Ohio. Because he was in Ohio in 1750, 1751. He overwintered with a native camp there, and he spent Christmas. He introduced them to Christmas. He had a Christmas service with them in their village. So in 1750, you had these 2 or 3 people just in here exploring. Then, you know, that's when the French and Indian War started ramping up. And so Gist had came back to Fort Necessity, wherever Washington was captain at the time, George Washington. And Gist was Washington's guide back into the Ohio country to make deals with the natives during the French and Indian War. And he actually saved his life a couple of times. This one time a saddle strap broke, and Washington was being drugged by his ankles, and just cut the whatever he cut off of it to free Washington. But then we come to what is known as the first documented long hunt in 61. So there was people in and out here during the French and Indian War, but there was a lot of infighting, a lot of pushing back and forth. But once all that was settled, they finally got the French pushed out, and relative peace among the Cherokee. A gentleman by the name of Elisha Wallen gathered up a bunch of relatives and friends and said, "There's money to be made here." So they gathered 2 horses per man. You know, they had 2 pack horses plus the horse they was riding, so 3 horses each. And all of their gear came into the Holston River area and hunted for 18 months.
Now, this is particularly interesting because the Holston River area was not navigable by white men at that point. They built a rock house there and moved in the Holston River Valley, and it was the only place there. It was the only structure built by white men there. So they were all there. It wasn't like 2 or 3 people. Everybody that was in the hunt gathered there before they started.
But, here's where we start picking up some of these names that we're familiar with. With Elisha Wallen, you have William and Jack Blevins, Henry Skaggs, Walter Newman, Charles Cox, about a dozen other unnamed people, which they may or may not have been slaves. There's no proof showing they were, but the fact that they were unnamed kind of hints toward that. And then for just a little while, they had a gentleman by the name of Daniel Boone. So that was, I guess, probably Boone's first long hunter, but he didn't travel all the way into Kentucky at that point. I'm just going to read this quote. It said, they found a veritable hunter's paradise. They feasted on the game and collected many skins and furs for the eastern market. In camp, they built pole scaffolds several feet above the ground on which they piled strips of bark, protected them from weather. When enough were collected, the men folded and packed the pelts in bales weighing 50 to 100 pounds, and 2 bales made a horse load. Now, when Wallen returned after his 18 months and sold off all of his hides, paid all of his men, he was loaded. He had more money than God. So, and people started noticing this, so other people started wanting to do this same thing. And that's where a lot of the push came from. But one of the reasons that the hides were so desirable is they didn't have access to this particular leather. It's the Virginia red deer. And it was some fashionable thing in London and Paris at the time to have a hat made out of this Virginia red deer. Plus they were using it for gloves and pants, and they just didn't have it. So we had it, and we had it in abundance. We were sending it to them.
The English don't have white-tailed deer. They had already exhausted that resource there in Europe. There was no white-tailed deer population. There was definitely no red deer, which is this color, this bright dun color, in that part of the world. And you're talking about a nation that they had already exhausted all of their trees building ships, firing forges, and fighting with swords for 1,000 years, 3,000 years up to that point. And now they're exporting things from the New World to them. So they were very interested in the colonies and in England in gaining these buckskins. Now, as he said that they feasted on the flesh, I'd like to point out before he goes any farther, there was no shortage of food for market hunters because they weren't selling that meat to Europe. It would never make it there. A lot of times they would kill these deer, skin them, and throw that meat over the hills. It was gone. There were records of the woodland buffalo, which are now extinct. They don't live here anymore. They would kill them and just leave them in the field, skin them and leave them, take their livers and their tongue and leave them, because it was of no value to them compared to that pelt, compared to that hide. And that becomes pertinent as we look more culturally about what impact that had on Native Americans and people in the area. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm almost finished. But to kind of bring Elisha Wallen back home, in 1763, he went on his third hunt. And with approximately the same group as before, they came through the Cumberland Gap and trapped on the headwaters of the Cumberland River. And they extended on into Rockcastle County and kept coming westward until they came to a large crab orchard. And he made that a notable spot. That crab orchard became the crossroads. When you come to Crab Orchard, you go, it's the center of the world. You start there and you go everywhere else. So, but as Brett said, when he started, while we were researching this, we started coming across the same 4 or 5 guys. But they never were, I don't want to say they weren't important, but they never were popularized. And I'm like the guy you're getting ready to talk about here, I'm sure, William Carr. I called him, he's the Forrest Gump of the 17th century. He was always around these very important happenings. And I'm sure that he did a lot more than what we know. So I'll let you talk about him.
So we'll backtrack a little bit about Thomas Walker, just a little bit. I touched on who Dr. Thomas Walker was, and I do emphasize that he was a doctor, because before he ever came into this area, he was a preeminent surgeon in the New World. He was a big name. He was a skilled surgeon, not doctor, surgeon in the New World. When you read through his journal, which is it is available online, and it's hit or miss. There will be 8 and 15 days between entries sometimes. He talks about field surgeries that he did on his party as they were moving. A man was thrown from a horse, and he bled him and gave him volatile drops, and he soon recovered. The man was skilled, but he also had a skill that a lot of these other guys didn't have, which we'll touch on later, is he could read and write. He could probably read and write in Latin at that point, probably do some speaking in French, and there is some evidence that he could probably speak at least some Cherokee. But Dr. Walker did some weird things. For one thing, he was heavily invested in the Loyal Land Company. He was a loyalist. When he came up to the Cumberland River, he dedicated it to the Duke of the Cumberland.
Yeah,
which was Prince William. That's why we called it the Cumberland Gap, because it was the gap that led to the Cumberland River. Thomas Walker decided that.
And Prince William was just coming off his big defeat of the Jacobites at the Battle of Culloden. So he was British royalty, and he was very famous at the time.
Right.
They called him Sweet William, but after Culloden, they started calling him the Bloody Butcher.
You know, he might have had a different type of personality than they thought at first. Dr. Walker also surrounded himself with important people. He spent a lot of time with a man named Peter Jefferson, and later served as an advisor to his son that you may have heard of before, named Thomas Jefferson. He was well known, he was well liked, and he was very wealthy. When he moved into the area, in his journal, he wrote early on, as they crossed over the gap, they came across some excellent coal and used it in their fires, meaning he was the first white man to come over the Cumberland Gap and burn coal in what is now Kentucky. That probably had a big impact on our culture, right? Dr. Thomas Walker is not credited with that, but historically, he is credited as the first person to document that he found, dug, and burnt coal in the state of Kentucky. Little interesting thing about the man. When we talk about Dr. Thomas Walker and the people that were competing for the same types of lands that he was pushing at that time, you had the Loyal Land Company, you had the Virginia Land Company, and the Transylvania, or who Daniel Boone was working for.
That was Richard Henderson and the Transylvania Company.
The Richard Henderson and the Transylvania Company, they were all competing for this land.
Ohio
because
Land Company.
The French had the west, the English had the east, Spanish had the bottom. They had Florida. Florida was there. They were sending prisoners there. That was theirs. The French were actually campaigning from Canada all the way down to the Gulf. They were in maneuvers. So the British decided early on, we have to find a way into this area. And the Cumberland Gap became that way. So moving into the Holston River Valley, and I'll pick up my notes here, and what I did is I printed more notes than Ike had, so I looked like I knew more than him. But what it actually is the same stuff 2 or 3 times. That's what I did. I have just a couple of things that I want to cover in this as we talk about these people moving through the area. There were as many as 500,000 white-tailed deer hides annually exported out of this area. That's according to David Hewitt, and he worked for the Journal of Environmental Studies during that time. They had documented that they were exporting out of what is now Kentucky, southeastern Kentucky, 500,000 white-tailed deer pelts. That is an unbelievable number when you start thinking about hauling 10 of them at a time out in a 100-pound bundle. That's a lot of deer hides. It's also, records show that there was 125, 135 white men in the area. Not all the people we're going to talk to tonight would be considered white men, but they were definitely not the indigenous folk that lived here. That's why we see these names showing up on and on again. These men stood per season to make the equivalent of $75,000 in a single season in today's money. So they would literally come back off of these hunts and they would be rich.
That's October to March.
October to March, yeah. And they would be rich. They would come back wealthy men. They'd come back, sell off their hides, be wealthy men. It became a practice to come into the area, go and say, if you'll sell me a gun on time, I'll come back in the spring and pay you for it. You were then indentured, or you had borrowed that money hoping to kill enough animals, kill enough game to pay your gun off and be out of here. One and done. You're one season and done. A lot of these men lost their lives during that season. But a lot of these men were lifelong hunters. Because you came back in March, you're rich, it's springtime, you hit stations and you were rich. And you had nothing to do. You didn't farm. You didn't have any family. Most of these men did not have a family until later in life. If you did have a family, they were to take care of themselves. You're a market hunter. That's what you did. You practiced your study. I learned how to shoot, maintain my gun, maintain my weapons, my knives, my tomahawks. I learned the area, I scouted the area, and we went on hunts. That's what we did. The idea that these men were wealthy probably leads you to believe the same thing that happens with the wealthy nowadays. When you're wealthy, you got plenty of money, and you don't have anything to do. Some of them were probably not the nicest folks to be around. They probably indulged a little bit too much in the recreation of the day, which was drinking, and they probably spent quite a bit of time in only the company of other rough men in the woods, long periods of time. Probably not the most welcoming people. But the people that we're going to talk about today that lived from the Holston River Valley up into this area were lifelong hunters. They didn't move on to other things later on in life. They were hunters. That's what they did. So these men knew their guns. That's my gun over there. That's my horn. That's my bag. If you're not in this type of thing, that was the bare minimum, right? Some of you guys that are reenactors or you're traditional hunters, that's your bare minimum, right? Keep that gun running and have a gun, correct? Market hunters, that was $76,000 sitting there. If I can't shoot, I can't make money. So they knew how to maintain their gun, and that's what they learned. The games and things that they played as children, hunting squirrels, hunting rabbits, finding animal tracks, they employed that as adults. And that was the knowledge that they had. So I do want to touch on that before we go much further. These men were specialized not only in hunting, but hunting in this area. They knew this area. So you can guarantee that they very quickly, adopted things that the indigenous folks were doing. So a lot of these men were found in Stroud with breechcloths rather than breeches because it's too hot and it's too cold and it's too muddy and it's too nasty to be running around in your wool frock great coat and your fineries and your straight-lasted shoes in the woods. They were wearing moccasins. They were carrying belt axes, tomahawks, knives, because they needed them to work, and they knew the natives knew what they were doing. When they came into this area from a technology standpoint, that's what I do for a living, is technology. From a technology standpoint, they were the most high-tech people here. When they came in over the gap, when the indigenous folks, when the Native Americans were hunting, the natives were here hunting, they were hunting with spears, atlatls, throwing sticks, bows and arrows. They traded for a few guns from the French. These men came in with adequate guns and powder, and they were killing deer like crazy. A lot of reports come back that the best part of hunting from the other side of the Cumberland Gap was the deer did not know to run after you shot the first one. So you'd shoot the first deer, stop and reload, and those deer are like, what was that? While they were reloading, take another shot, shoot the next deer. And then the rest of the deer goes, what was that? Until they had literally killed 15, 20 deer before they got the idea to run away. Buffalo were the same way. They were killing buffalo because at that point, natives were killing buffalo as a game of endurance. They were running them off of cliffs, running them till they were too tired and killing them with an atlatl. They were definitely not riding up on them on a good trail horse and shooting them with a .62 caliber round ball at 1,100 feet per second and leaving them laying. Definitely not. The technology of the time, these men were the most. It would be the same thing as somebody touched down right now here with a laser gun. We would not expect it. We wouldn't know what to do with it, and they would completely just wipe the landscape. For the longest time, your market hunters were superior in every aspect to the indigenous folks who were trying to hunt this area because they have industrialized this area. They were here to kill animals and make money off those animals. The natives, they didn't do that. The indigenous folk, they were not doing that at that scale. They weren't killing, what did he say, 53 bears?
Yeah.
Have you ever saw 53 bears in your life? Thomas Walker saw them on a short jaunt over a hillside, and they killed all of them. Probably not ethical hunters. How'd they kill all those turkeys? Anybody turkey hunt here? Anybody ever turkey hunt? They killed them about this time of evening when they flew on the roost, or when they flew off the roost in the morning, and they killed them one right after another as fast as they could shoot. Guaranteed. But that's a different time. Before I digress too far on that, there's a couple of folks that I do want to talk about here. This is when I let my guard down and show you these are my notes. This was here to make me seem more important. When we talk about the folks that were here in the area, before the Columbian intervention, before the Europeans entered here, there were 5 to 10 million indigenous people in what is now the continental United States. By the time Thomas Walker reached here, it was estimated that there might have been 1.5 million of these people left. There was just not a lot of people here. If we all got together on a long hunt as market hunters, there was a possibility that we could have been completely disappeared in the wilderness and no one else would ever know we were there. And market hunters counted on that. They counted on being able to operate without the indigenous folk running into them. Because when I was shooting my 500,000 white-tailed deer in a 400-mile circle in the United States, I was making a dent in the population for the native population to take, right? When they were riding through their hunted areas and they go, we're going to go and we'll observe the buffalo on our ceremony, and they found 47 buffalo dead in a field, skinned with their tongues and livers cut out and left to rot, they weren't happy about it. We were here we were raiding their cupboard. They always counted on this area. It was a natural boundary from the foothills of the Appalachia, cut it off from the east. They knew they could come here to find food, and now we knew we could come here to find hides. And it made a difference. It made a difference. Let's hear it.
This area was almost like a demilitarized zone for a lot of indigenous people from the south, from the west, from the north especially. this land for, it was a giant game reserve essentially. So by the time these people across the gap came in here for about 10,000 years, natives have been cultivating this land simply for game reserve.
And we raided that storehouse. We did.
Absolutely.
The idea of, it's ridiculous to me as someone who has hunted, thinking of taking a shot at a deer, literally killing a deer and a group of deer, and the rest of the deer don't know what that means because they've never been shot at before. And we have some references here when we talk about some of these guys that was just the case. That it's ridiculous to think that wildlife was so thick and so ready that they just didn't understand that there was any danger in just wandering around as wildlife. Because that's the indigenous and the native population did not live that lifestyle. If there were 5 deer, they weren't here to kill 5 deer. But market hunters, if there were 5 deer, they were here to kill those 5 deer. And any more they could get a hold of. You will also notice that nowhere in market ledgers does it say these deer must be 4 to 6 years of age, fully grown. They'd shoot the spots off of them. They didn't care. So, before we get into these individuals, and that's my next piece, I want to touch on a couple things that Aki said, talking about bundles of hide that was moved out of this area as quote-unquote green hides. They were not tanned. They were not worked. They had been fleshed, salted, and rolled. We know that because historically we have tons of happenings going to salt licks. We all know what happened at Blue Licks where the salt makers were taken. They were producing salt to be used by these hunters to export. So there's a lot of confusion as to whether or not they exported fish out of this area. I cannot imagine why they would export fish in this area. But there are records that show, when we talk about, where's his name here? Well, Thomas Walker talks about when they came to the forks of the Kentucky River, that the fish were so thick it seemed as though the water was alive. That part of the world, that's where we're from.
Yeah, said you could walk across the river on the backs of fish
and not get your hat wet.
Not get
your hat wet. Now, realistically, forks of the Kentucky River, you're not going to get your hat wet anyway. It's not that deep. But historically, it sounded really good, right? It sounded like everything was alive. So there was an average of these 10 hides in a bundle that weighed 100 pounds. These 10 hides probably worth quite a bit. 10 hides in a bundle to you and I would be $250, $300 in today's money, easy. At certain points in the market, it went as high as being $2,000 in the market. So you were also a target to the indigenous for what? Sam's walking around with 6 bundles of hides. Sam's a big walking piggy bank that doesn't know where he's at. Me and my friends, the natives who live in the area, hunt in the area, can talk to each other sounding like bears. We know our way through the woods in the dark. We can whistle at each other like birds, and you will never know we're on you. And they would kill them and take their hides and sell them.
And they're still weapons.
They're still weapons because the natives were not in the Iron Age. They traded into the Iron Age. They did not develop iron. They traded for iron. They were fighting with stone weapons. So heck yeah, I'll take your metal knife. Heck yeah, I will take your gun. Your copper kettles. There was a whole industry for market hunters to trade with natives, things like trade kettles that were made to trade with the natives. Let me give you the shiny stuff, show me where the deer are. And they did. There's a record, and I have it in my notes, in that pile of notes, and we won't go back, that these natives came upon a trade camp in the fall of the year and made friends with these trade market hunters. They visited them throughout the winter.
That may or may not have been that Christopher Gist that I mentioned earlier.
I believe it's Christopher Gist. I believe it was, but I would have to dig a little bit deeper. They traded with them throughout the winter. Thank you so much for this deer meat that you're not going to use anyway. You guys are doing great. You're killing all kinds of deer. They worked all winter gathering hides, trapping beaver, killing elk, and the natives would visit. You're doing so great. You 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, write that down. You're doing great. And when the springtime come, they said, you 7 guys have done so well, and you've gathered all your stuff up to come up to England. Me and my 25 Braves are going to take everything you own and leave you. And you can leave here with your life now, and that's it. You've worked all winter, and we're going to take your, not $75,000, but there's 5 of you, so we're going to take your $2.75 million in hides and all of your guns and your knives and not kill you.
And then we go north and trade them up to people like the Hudson Bay Company.
Exactly.
And places like that. Scottish tradesmen.
Or take them west and trade them to the French, who were using them too. So these people were walking piggy banks in the woods. And what that meant was they were cunning and they were tough. So we're going to talk about one of my favorite people first, who's William Carr. Now, William Carr, there's very little documented about William Carr. I am decided that he is an oddity in that because William Carr was very well educated. He could likely read and write, but due to who he was not bound to boast and brag about himself. So the following document is discussing from Lyman Draper's manuscript when he was interviewing a gentleman named John Redd. John Redd knew a lot of notable market hunters in the area. This is aside from all the Lyman Draper interviews with Daniel Boone and other people of notoriety. He interviewed this guy who knew a lot of people. And William Carr is one of the people that he knew. It says that little was known or little was left about William Carr. He was raised in Albemarle County, Virginia, and at a very early age moved to the frontier. That's it. So, here's some other notes that was throughout multiple interviews that Draper did about William Carr, or William Kerr, who I would argue is more than likely the same person. In 1775, William Carr became acquainted to him in Powell's Valley. In Powell's Valley, he lived on the frontier for 20 years and had spent that entire time hunting. He had spent 20 seasons hunting Holston River, Cumberland Gap, southeastern Kentucky. Part of this interview takes place at Martin Station as well, just so you know. So he had moved in and out of those areas. And largely, if you sit down with a map and drew, it would have been a large figure 8 moving in and out of Kentucky. Carr hunted in Kentucky beyond the Cumberland Mountains to the right of the Cumberland Gap in a place called the Bush. That's Pineville, by the way, if you want to know where that would be. If he was to the right of Cumberland Gap. Carr always returned with his horses laden with furs and skins. He described the game as being so gentle the animals rarely ran from the report of his gun, should he use one. Odd little comment to make, an historical record in an interview. Should he use one? Carr was the most venturesome hunter I ever knew. He would frequently go on these hunting expeditions alone, from October to March, alone, by himself. There's a reason for that. We're going to get there in just a minute. After the breaking out of the Indian War in 1776, few men ventured on these long hunts because they were, white men were the bad guy. You would get killed, get tomahawked and left for dead. Carr determined to take more long hunts, and as no one would go with him, he determined to go alone. I do not know just where Carr resided on the frontier. It's hard to trace his name since the records show both a William Carr and William Kerr. William Kerr was in a land suit in 1809, Fugit versus Mahan, that regards that Fugit purchased a piece of property off of a man named William Kerr, who was a mulatto man. Does anybody know what that means? He was half black, half white. So now we know that he was a mulatto. He was a mixed race individual on the frontier. We also know that he was a accomplished hunter and had spent 20 years of his life making around $70,000 a year. The man had money. He was well traveled. Lots of times went by himself, and what that means is if he went by himself, there's a good possibility he was making way more than $70,000 a year. He didn't have to split it with anybody. If you had a big operation, you and I would be hunting. I would be fleshing your hides, and I would get my quarter share, and you two would get the other 3/4 split between you, because I didn't have to hunt. If you're by yourself, you're doing all the work, but you're making all the money. Now here's the part where, and this is my favorite part, where William Carr becomes important to me. William Carr is supposed to be near relation to General Joseph Martin. John Redd told Lyman Draper that William Carr was born in Albemarle County, Virginia. We know that already. He was the first son of his mother, and her husband were both very respectable people who owned land, and that meant at the time they owned slaves, just so you know. When William was born, he turned out to be a dark mulatto. This is William Carr now. This is relating him to William Kerr and tying him into being the same person. The old man, being a good sort of fellow, raised him until he turned 18. When he turned 18, he gave him some money and a gun, and he said, "You need to go to the frontier and make your fortune and never return." Is that not the beginnings of an adventure movie if you've ever heard one? I'm this unique individual on the frontier of 125, 150 men. Go and make your fortune, but don't return, because you might ruin my good standings in the community. So I don't want to ever see you again. William Carr is the epitome of he's on the frontier, making his way because he has nowhere to return to. From the time he's 17, 18, he has nowhere to return to. He was well educated, according to what Draper could gather on the man. At the end of his life, he was supposed to be a well-reputed father, a well-reputed community leader who would move to the defensive stations wherever he might find himself, but he was a lifelong hunter, and he just disappeared from history. Gone. He spent 20 years on this frontier. There is no way he didn't cross paths with people. He had to have been here. He was wealthy. And you can guarantee he was what we would call today a hard man, a difficult man. That's so much for this note. Now, we're going to talk about my favorite person and also Miss Marion's favorite person. We're going to talk about Michael Stoner. Michael Stoner is important because Michael Stoner's name is his legacy. Everyone knew he was Michael Stoner. So I'm going to drop a historical record fact on you very early on that Michael Stoner was born in 1748. That's where his interesting story begins, in my personal opinion. He was born in the same region of the world that Daniel Boone was from. They were very close to each other. He was of German-speaking background. In fact, records show, and they made a point to point out, that Michael Stoner had a very thick German accent his entire life. So he never moved on from that.
As far as to phonetically spell it out.
They went so far as to phonetically spell things that they could quote him saying, and it's very difficult to read. And I'll read a piece of it in a minute. Now, who's heard of Michael Stoner before? Do you know Michael Stoner's name was not Michael Stoner? Do you know that there was a Michael Stoner? Let's begin. Michael Stoner's original family name was Holsteiner. Holsteiner. They were German. In this area, they were responsible for things like these animals called Holstein cows, because they were Holsteiners. They were a breed of cows that were raised in German descent. They're a very small, evenly tempered cow, just so you know, if you ever want to know. Holstein cows. Michael Stoner moved into this area in the Holstein Valley, the Holstein Valley that was named after his father, who settled in the area originally. Two brothers moved into the area, Peter and John Holsteiner, when they left the Rhine. When they moved here, Peter had two sons. Peter's sons' names were Michael Holsteiner and George Michael Holsteiner. In the following conversation, which one of those two do you think we're talking about? Because it's definitely not Michael Holsteiner. He settled in the area, raised a family, and lived a good life and died. That's what he did. But George Michael Holsteiner done everything else. He was everywhere. He ran into people. As a matter of fact, the article that I'm reading from is called Michael Stoner, the Frontiersman Who Was Always There. Michael Stoner was everywhere. Michael Stoner was a career hunter. He moved in and out of stations. He moved in and out of forts, and he traveled where the money and the action was. That's what he was interested in. Michael Stoner found himself coming into this area with James Harrod. Famous guy, right? We all know James Harrod. Michael Stoner is also famous as being one of the last people who saw James Harrod alive when James Harrod left. At one point in history, James Harrod and Michael Stoner were both found at Fort Loudon, where two market hunters had returned with some ore they had dug from the earth across the Holston River Valley. The ore that they dug from the earth, they broke open and melted and found it to be silver of excellent quality. Michael Stoner and James Harrod, somewhere around 17 years after that, found themselves in the area and crossed into an area of today, which is where we're from, looking for Swift Silver Mine, at which James Harrod disappeared and was never seen again. Later on, records were found that someone had found his hunting shirt or something.
Hunting shirt stuffed in a...
Michael Stoner was there. Michael Stoner had an excellent friend throughout life that he went on many long hunts with, named Daniel Boone. There's one record that Daniel Boone tells that Michael Stoner was once aggravating. I love this story.
Cow buffalo.
He was aggravating a cow buffalo. So they had her corralled. They had ran her until she was tired, and they were pestering her, trying to get her to turn for a good shot, probably. And Daniel Boone says that the cow turned and charged on Michael Stoner, who was on foot. And he yelled, and I quote, "Shoot her, Capitan, shoot her!" And Daniel Boone thought it was so hilarious that he could not draw his gun and shoot. The man they knew each other. Michael Stoner could never read and write. He could not read nor write. He did not seek fame. So his story is adjacent to history. Interesting story that I found in my studies when Lyman Draper was interviewing Daniel Boone was the last long hunt that Daniel Boone went on was at the invite of Michael Stoner, who he had invited to come to his home. When Michael Stoner came to his home, he said, "This is a nice place you got here, Daniel. Is there any good hunting around?" The man was 66 at this time. And Daniel, being the eldest of the two, said, "Excellent." And Michael said, "Well, let's go." And 22 months later, they found themselves on the other side of the state when Daniel Boone decided, being of poor health, that he must return and go home. And Michael Stoner said, "I'll see you on my way home," and went on his adventure. Michael Stoner moved into the falls through Louisville and went as far, in some reports, as possibly Minnesota before he turned around and came back and stopped at Daniel Boone's again, because why not? Stop at your famous friend's house, right? Daniel Boone reports that was the most successful long hunt that he was ever on. Very interesting story, Michael Stoner being a famous person that possibly due to his lack of ability to read and write or his willingness to publicize himself, may have been lost to history should we not just hear his name from time to time. According to Daniel Boone's son, Nathan Boone, Michael Stoner was an awkward Dutchman that spoke with a heavy accent. He was truthful and reliable. In 1767, at age 19, Stoner accompanied Daniel Boone on his first long hunt expedition in Kentucky country. He, along with Samuel Harrod and Boone, passed through the Cumberland Gap to winter for a short while. When they crossed over, they split up and rejoined each other in the spring. These men spent all winter in the woods alone. When we move on and hit some of the bigger pieces of where Michael Stoner was, the first settlement attempt in Kentucky was an unsuccessful one, led by Daniel Boone and Richard Henderson, and guess who else was there? William Bush and Bush's nephew, Michael Stoner. When we go all the way down to Lord Dunmore's war, Michael Stoner was there with Daniel Boone. I'm trying to find my last piece here. When the salt makers were captured, and Daniel Boone volunteered to find them. Correct? Let me find my notes here. I'm so sorry. This is so massive, and I'm giving this to you, by the way, when I leave, because it's so massive, and I have it digitally.
You mean when they were captured, and Boone's third or fourth capture, whatever that was?
Here it is. This has got my piece in it. In the heat of battle, Michael Stoner and Bush had fired twice. As Bush was moved off the battlefield and Michael Stoner was shot through the wrist, by the way, ending his career as a market hunter, you would think, but no. He yelled, "Them yellow rascals will shoot us. We are too big a park. Billy Bush." What?
Billy Bush was Billy Bush.
Billy Bush. He had such a huge, deeply German accent that they quoted him in history as saying illegible things. Probably one of the reasons he was not recorded accurately as being the hero that he was. Michael Stoner pointed an empty rifle at natives during that battle, during their escape. Because they didn't know. Very brave man. As we go on and we follow through the battles and different things that Michael Stoner was in, you find him at Blue Licks. In 1786, later on in life, you find that Michael Stoner married a woman named Frances Tribble. She was the daughter of Reverend Andrew Tribble and his wife, Sarah Ann Burness. He was 38, she was 17. As a result, he settled in a place called Clark County, Kentucky. In 1797, he moved to an area in the Cumberland River called Pulaski County, and then on near to Monticello. And there's a place called Stoner's Fork in the Licking River named after Michael Stoner. I tried to skip on to the very ends of this and the pieces that I thought were important for you. There are several things about Michael Stoner that made him unique in that he consistently came to the aid or to the side of people on the frontier without question. He volunteered to go to rescue. In some places we know now historically that Daniel Boone claims he was the first to volunteer, when in fact historical record shows that Michael Stoner was the first person to volunteer. We find him time and time at the side of Daniel Boone, even later in life as a companion. Michael Stoner was a long-time market hunter in the area who knew many famous people. He was on their adventures with them, but we don't hear a lot about what has happened with him. And there's a good possibility that that is all lost to history. He was just, in one story that I read with market hunters, a number of German immigrants or German tradesfolk. If you look chronologically, he was more than likely on that hunt. But they didn't know his name. You talked to him and his accent was so deep, and he could not read or write. How would you know his name? That's why he was Michael Stoner, not George Michael Holsteiner. Lost to history. So what happened was when we started this, and I'm not going to take up much more of your time because it's getting cold, I know. We started talking about the hardships and the hard life and the difficult life that these men found themselves in to make money. And they were making money. They were changing the United States. They were changing the New World. They were changing Kentucky. But there were a lot more people here than Simon Kenton, James Harrod, and Daniel Boone. There were people that were lost to history, like William Kerr, William Redd, who may very well have been the same person. History shows that there was a gentleman in the area that was working as a market hunter named William Redd, who they thought might have been half native, or mulatto maybe. Who knows? But the entire story is lost to history, other than that he was an insanely good shot. That was part of that story. There were other gentlemen, and I only have his name in my notes, but I do have an article that I'll share with you if you'd like it. I want to dig all the way down to it. Because here's one of the strangest stories to me on the frontier, because I have all of it in its entirety.
All 18 words of it?
All 18 words of it. There were people here. That quick, I've lost my notes. There were people here that lived their entire lives, worked as market hunters, but were never famous and were never called by name. One of which, there we go, was a gentleman named Thomas Sharp Spencer. Thomas Sharp Spencer lived his entire life going on market hunts and then spending every dime he made in stations. He was known to be an exceptionally big eater, a big drinker, and that he would find places that he thought were prone to be susceptible to native attack, and that's where he would stay. He would often winter in dead sycamore trees that were large enough for him to live in. That becomes pertinent in a moment. Records show that the man was tall enough that in one given story, he placed the second level log of a rock house by himself from the ground.
While he was sick.
Records show that he weighed the equivalent of 400 pounds and might have been as tall as 7 feet tall in a time when I was a tall man. Can you believe it, Sam? I was a tall guy once. Yeah, give me a time machine, man. I'd have been a tall guy. This guy was a giant. He was huge. Could reload his flintlock rifle without taking it from his shoulder. Big man. He was ambushed and killed by natives. That's all we know about him, other than he had lived his entire life market hunting and spending his money in forts and stations. Now, as we stand in Logan Station, there's a possibility there might have been a 7-foot-tall, 400-pound man here. We don't have any records of him because nobody knew the guy. He lived months and months and months in the woods, and then he was just that rich guy that showed up into town. That was the story of a lot of these folks. So that's what we discovered when we began our research and we started talking about hard lives. And when Marion and I talked, and we talked about doing this talk, this speech, I thought, I'll come and I'll set up my camp and we'll look at a full market camp. We'll stretch a hide, we'll have guns, we'll look at the shooting bags. But I was a high school teacher. You have a flintlock at home. You don't need to see mine. What I realized is there was a much more interesting story to tell of those men that were adjacent to history. Now, what I'd like to do, I have no idea how long we've been talking. Do you?
No.
She does.
It's 6:39, so you're still.
I don't want to continue to just spout information. I've found particular interest in Michael Holsteiner, who I will refer to as George Michael Holsteiner now for the rest of my life. I found a lot of interest in William Carr, who was a dramatic story because he had nothing to do but to survive. And I found a lot of interest in some of these stories, like Dr. Walker, who moved through the Cumberland Gap and wound up in our part of the world, where I live. I know some of you all are experts in this field and you've done a lot of research. I'd love for you to share any stories that you have. I would like to point out one other thing, and I like to name drop. So, Mr. Kane over here, who presented about the Hart brothers in the spring, Michael Stoner found himself on the hunt of the Hart brothers at one point, correct? Could you imagine? You're Michael Stoner. You're a market hunter. You're rich. You don't need anything. And there's serial killers in the area. The first serial killers in the area. And you immediately rise to action and jump to hunt the Hart brothers. Remarkable people, tough people, strong people. Anybody have any questions? Anything that I can dig through all these papers and pretend to be important? Or anything of that nature?
Absolutely.
Right.
You don't know much about it. You don't find out much about it. Before you run into his name. And how you don't know about their relationships much. But he keeps showing up. He keeps saving people, helping people. He's with some kitten.
Right.
And basically saves him. He's with James Harrod comes in, surveying, but more than anything, James Harrod asks him to go on that last time because he doesn't trust the other man's there. I can't use that,
Yeah, I know it. Hang on. I'm wanting to say Stewart, but it's not Stewart.
I can't think of it, but anyway, he doesn't trust him. He's had legal problems with him. And definitely trusts.
And that's the part there. Everyone thought highly of him.
That's what I'm saying. Everybody thought highly of him, respected him, and liked him, as far as I could tell.
In a time that he was a minority in the area, in a group of 125 men from here to the Cumberland Gap. It was 125 men. And Michael Stoner's one of them.
And we don't know much about him. But you keep running into his names. He's always with other people that you know about. I think that's what's so intriguing about him.
He's right there. He is the Forrest Gump of history. He's right there.
One of the best things that is time period you talk about one thing, this is coming to a whole other story. Swift Silver,
Oh, yeah.
entirely crazy story.
Right.
Yeah, we could talk for 2 more hours on Swift Silver Mine. So
That's an entire story. Which is what did up in Glasgow. Again, there was reports that Harrod went up to the silver mine, but there was some reports that he prevented the majority of the other family. And he was like, take notices.
Right. Right.
There's all kinds of twists and turns throughout the entire time period that we often wait and they certainly forgot. So we.
yeah, you just lose them.
So there's a story, and I have it buried deep in these notes, where Draper is talking to that gentleman who knew a lot of market hunters. And he's talking about running into a man that he calls Red Will. Now, Red Will is a reference to 2 different people in history. In Clay County in Tennessee, they definitely killed a Native American man they called Red Will in the river, dropped him in a hole of water, they found his body, blah, blah, blah. This market hunter is talking about a guy that he ran into named Red Will, who was of dark skin and wild temperament, but well spoken, who was in possession of bundles of hides. There's no way that was not William Carr. But at that time period, if you were William Carr, you would much rather someone think you were a Native American than the illegitimate child of someone who had disbanded you from their home. So his story may be lost to history because he hid who he was. He didn't admit who he was until much later in life, is what I've found. He just went by Will. I'm William Carr. Nowhere near his real name. It's lost to history just because of the culture of the time. But these men were not getting married, so there weren't ledgers of their names. When they were getting paid at the market, they weren't making them. They were making their mark. X, here's your $75,000, sir. Move on. Not a lot of records of what these men did, and I find that sad. I find it amazing. But as someone who's involved in living history, it's so exciting. I would love to think that William Carr stopped in Logan Station to cash in at one point. He was in this area. He was moving in this area. I would love to think that William Carr and Benjamin Logan crossed paths somewhere at some point.
Well, it's impossible for them to not have.
They had to. But there's no record of it. I would love to think that Michael Stoner sat right over here where these two little pine trees are that I've camped under for 10 years and said, man, look at that big electric pole. No, he said he was here at some point. You know, I would love to think that there were people here that were that monumental in history walking in the same tracks that I am. And that's what I found interesting. And I think that's where the most interesting points are. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add? Have you heard of William Carr? Did he steal your neighbor's goat or something? I don't know.
Michael Stoner say about knives is supposed to be